Welcome to the podcast for Westside, a Jesus Church. We hope this teaching encourages and empowers you to love, learn, and live the way of Jesus.
And verse 1, it was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave the world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. If you've been tracking with us in our study through the Gospel of John, you've seen this phrase come up over and over again. And it's this phrase, the hour had not come. In fact, if you're taking notes, you may remember back in John chapter 2, when they wanted Jesus to turn water into wine, and Jesus said, no, my hour has not yet come. Or in John chapter 7, verse 8, Jesus chose not to go up to Jerusalem because his hour had not yet come. Or in John chapter 8, they tried to arrest Jesus, and they couldn't because his hour had not yet come. So what we've seen over this last year going through the Gospel of John is this phrase, the hour. But now here in John chapter 13, John lets us know that the hour had come. All the events and the teachings and the miracles and the moments of seeing the Spirit work in and through Jesus' life were now leading us to this moment, this culmination of Jesus' mission, his vision, and his purpose. And what was Jesus' purpose? Well, we have this beautiful line in verse 1. It says that Jesus loved his disciples to the end. I love that. Because if ever there were a group of people that were difficult to love, it was his disciples. I mean, they had issues. They were immature. They were argumentative. In fact, another gospel tells us that right before Jesus washed their feet, they've been having this big argument about who was the greatest. You see, Jesus, even though they had weaknesses and flaws and a ton of dirt in their life, he still loved them to the end. And this is such good news for us, at least it is for me. Jesus doesn't just love the best version of you, he loves the worst version of you. Man, he loves us when we're grumpy, when we're selfish, when we don't make room for him. He loves us when we choose anxiety over the peace that he offers. He loves us when we don't pray enough. He loves us when we're upset with someone. He loves us when we make those sharp comments to our wife because we haven't had our third cup of coffee in the morning. He loves us to the end. His love is unconditional. And because his love is unconditional, it means that there is literally nothing that we can do that would separate us from his love. You know, one of my favorite authors who speaks a lot about this radical, generous, even scandalous love of God is Brennan Manning. And there's this line in one of his books. He says, "For grace proclaims the awesome truth that all is gift. All that is good is ours, not by right, but by the sheer bounty of a gracious God. While there is much we may have earned, our degree, our salary, our home and garden, all this is possible only because we've been given so much. Life itself, eyes to see and hands to touch, a mind to shape ideas, and a heart to beat with love. We have been given God in our souls and Christ in our flesh. We have the power to believe where others deny, to hope where others despair, to love where others hurt. This and so much more is a sheer gift. It is not reward for our faithfulness, our generous disposition, or our heroic life of prayer. Even our fidelity is a gift. If we but turn to God, said Augustine, that itself is a gift of God. My deepest awareness of myself is that I'm deeply loved by Jesus and I have done nothing to earn it or deserve it." That's good news, right? And that's the heart of the gospel. He loved his disciples to the end. Question though, what does love look like? It's easy to tell someone that you love them. It's easy to feel emotion towards a person, but what does it actually mean to love them? Jesus in John 13 is gonna show us what love looks like. In the words of Bob Goff, love does. So let's see what Jesus does. Verse 2, the evening meal was in progress and the devil had already prompted Judas, we'll talk about Judas next week, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. And so he got up from the meal, he took off his outer clothing, and he wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that, he poured water into a basin and he began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, let's pause there for a moment because it's 2019 and foot washing for the most part, isn't a thing, right? This is kind of hard for us to relate to. Now, if you've ever been to Fiji, I've been there a couple times years ago. In Fiji, they actually do practice this in some of their villages. But for the most part, you don't see this happening. And what you need to know is that in the ancient world, foot washing was a sign of hospitality, hygiene, and honor and respect. First of all, let's talk about the hygiene. Streets in the ancient world, especially in first century Palestine, were all dirt. Some historians say that they were about an inch thick of dirt. When it began to rain, it was liquid mud. And on top of that, there were a ton of animals and waste. So you're walking through these streets and they're getting dirty and it's gross and it's smelly. When you showed up at someone's house, generally, they actually had a basin of water right there by the door. You would walk in, and keep in mind, a third to a half of the Roman Empire in the first century was servants or slaves. A servant would meet you at the door with this basin of water, and you knew it was a servant because in the ancient world, a servant always wore a towel before stepping into the living room, because they don't want you to drag all that stuff through their house. The servant then would kneel down and begin to wash your feet, cleaning all the dirt off of you. And then you would step into the house. So this was a way for them not only to clean you because you needed it and you smelled, but it was also a way because, well, to show you honor, to show you respect, to say you are welcome here. If you've ever read Homer's Odyssey, remember Odysseus? And after the battle, he was then experienced his feet being washed by Euclea, as a sign of her admiration for him, as a sign of, wow, you've won this battle. Let me show you my respect. Now, here's what's fascinating. Even though foot washing was very, very common in the ancient world, it was practiced everywhere, you would never, in fact, there's no examples in history, in literature, in other religions, of a rabbi, a master, or a teacher washing the feet of a student. This never happened. It was always the other way around. And yet Jesus flips the script. After they enjoyed a meal together, which was essentially communion, Jesus took bread and he broke it. He took a cup and he blessed it. Eat and drink in remembrance of me. Jesus gets up and it says he takes off his outer clothes. He puts on a towel, something that only servants would wear. He takes a basin of water and he goes to his disciples, kneels down, and one by one, he starts to wash their feet. He washed the feet of John, who wrote this book. He was the disciple who Jesus loved, which, by the way, John said that about himself. He washed the feet of John. He washed the feet of Peter, who was about to deny that he knew him. He washed the feet of Judas, who was about to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. These feet that were dirty, crusty, smelly, ugly, athlete's foot, Jesus washed them one by one. Now, what's going on here is so much more than just a hygienic moment. Because the Apostle Paul, he would pick up on these ideas in the book of Philippians chapter 2. This is so worth writing down if you're taking notes. Grab a pen, piece of paper, iPhone, notes app, in airplane mode. Philippians chapter 2, Paul says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Let's keep this up there for just a moment. Think about Philippians 2 as it pertains to what Jesus is doing in John chapter 13. There's all kinds of analogies and similarities. First of all, Jesus is God. He rises up from his throne. Even as Jesus stood up after supper, he takes off his outer clothes, even as he divested himself of his divine privileges. He humbled himself, took on the form of a servant. He wrapped himself in a towel. He gets on his knees and he starts to serve and love in a radical, generous, scandalous way. He washes the dirt off the feet of his disciples. Even as Jesus, when he died on the cross, his sacrifice for us would wash our dirt and our shame and our past and our mistakes and our regret. Now, theologians have a term for this. They call it kenosis. Kenosis. Let me hear you say kenosis. It's a beautiful term, and I encourage you, if you have time later on this week, do some more research on it. But kenosis, which has its roots here in Philippians chapter 2, which is lived out in John chapter 13, literally means self-emptying. Jesus is the self-emptying God. Jesus poured out himself, his life, his time, his energy, his passion, his blood, so that we, his disciples, his followers, could be rescued, redeemed, filled, and restored. And what Jesus did for his disciples in John 13, Philippians 2, kenosis, is what he has done for you and is what he will someday do for all of creation. He is the self-emptying God. Now, if you want to go into the Old Testament and see echoes of this and prophecies of this, again, this is worth writing down. Psalm chapter 22. David, in Psalm 22, which is a prophecy of the cross, he's talking about what the cross felt like, what it looked like. In fact, Jesus, when he died on the cross, he actually quoted from Psalm 22 when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What's interesting, though, about this psalm is that David, he describes kenosis in a very visceral, emotive kind of way. He says, I am poured out like water. I am a worm and not a man. I'm scorned by everyone. I'm despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults at me, shaking their heads. Again, think Philippians 2. He was made of no reputation. Kenosis, I am poured out like water. Do you realize that when Jesus died on the cross, they thrust a spear into his side, and what came out? Blood and water. Jesus poured out everything for us, culminating at this moment in the cross, kenosis, and he didn't hold back. Could it be then that this self-emptying God, could it be then why he says on the cross those two words, I thirst, because he poured out everything for us, living water being poured out for us, his children, so that we could be rescued and redeemed. But here's another interesting bit. David in Psalm 22, he uses this phrase. He says, I am a worm and not of man. Again, think no reputation, think servant. But even deeper than that is this word worm that David uses. I looked it up, did some research on it. Really fascinating. The word worm that David uses is the word toloth. Let me hear you say toloth. Toloth is translated as a scarlet worm, not just a worm, a scarlet worm. You're like, what does that mean? Well, in the ancient world, most people, their clothes weren't all that colorful, but if you had the cash, you could afford to have your clothes dyed. It was a very, very expensive process. And one of the ways they did it was to turn your clothes scarlet. Again, think of like what kings would wear, is they would take this toloth worm and they would put it in this container, this vat. And they were very rare. It was a costly process. They'd pile up the toloth, and then someone would, it's kind of gross, they would crush the toloth worm, kind of making this wormy, bloody looking pulp. They would then take the clothes, dip the clothes into that soup, and your clothes would be dyed red, made scarlet. Interesting, David says, I am a toloth and not a man, when he's talking about the cross. Now, here's another interesting bit about the toloth. When the toloth wanted to die, or rather reproduce, give birth, the toloth would climb up a tree, and in the process of giving birth, it would give its life. It would die in the process of having children. And you would always know, oh, there's a toloth, because you would see a red spot on a tree, which after a few days would turn white, and then eventually the wind would blow it away. Fascinating that hundreds of years before the cross, David prophetically saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Kenosis, I am poured out like water, would also say, I'm a toloth and not a man, because isn't that what Jesus did? He was pinned to the cross. He died so that we could be born again, so that we could be his sons and daughters. And the book of Isaiah says, so that our sin, which is as scarlet, may be as what? White as snow. Jesus is the self-emptying God. And you see all of these themes. I wish we had hours and we don't. You're like, praise God. But in John chapter 13, we see all these themes of forgiveness and healing and redemption and grace and our sin being covered by the sacrificial God, the God who pours himself out so that we could be filled with his love and his grace. What an epic, beautiful, powerful moment, and leave it up to Peter to mess it all up. Check this out, verse 6 says he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you gonna wash my feet? And Jesus replied, you do not realize what I'm doing, but later you will understand. We talked about this about a month ago. There are times in our life when Jesus is doing things in our life that we don't understand, that we don't get. And the best thing to do at those times is not to run away, take our feet out of the basin, but to stay put and to let him do what he's gonna do. What I'm doing now, you do not understand, but you will understand someday. And then Peter argues. He says, no, you shall never wash my feet. And Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. And Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body's clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. Interesting. For he knew who was going to betray him. And that was why he said not everyone was clean. You know, I make fun of Peter a lot here, and I'm sure I'm going to have to give account of it someday when I meet him in heaven. That'll be interesting. Pray for me. But this is what I love about Peter, is that Peter had this all or nothing kind of personality. And I just love that. I love it when I see people who burn hot for Jesus. You know, Jesus said it's better to be hot or cold, but the lukewarm I'm gonna spit out of my mouth. And sometimes those who burn hot for Jesus, they can go a little overboard, right? And Jesus goes to him, he's like washing, he's like, no, you can't wash my feet. He's a little arrogant here. And Jesus like, actually, if you don't let me wash my feet, you have no part of me. He's like, okay, grab the whole thing, let's do this. I want a bath. And he's like, whoa, hold on. You don't need all of you washed. Now, sometimes we'll meet people who kind of have this Peter mentality. And again, I love it. I think especially on baptism Sundays, and we invite people to the waters. And here at Westside, we believe that, like scripture teaches, that you confess with your mouth, you believe in your heart, you're saved. That's your moment of salvation. And I think the first act of obedience then is to get baptized. It's not the baptism that saves you. Anyone can jump in water, but it's giving your life to Jesus. That's the moment of salvation. Baptism is the first step of obedience, saying, okay, publicly, here on out, I'm following after Jesus. But there are times, we'll open up the waters of baptism. And one of the first questions we ask people back in this room is, have you been baptized before? And occasionally we'll meet people kind of like Peter. They're like, yeah, I've been baptized 17 times at all these different churches. I got baptized here and here and here and here. And you know the kinds of people I'm talking about. It's like there's any opportunity to get saved and like running to the front or raising their hand. Yeah, I'm going to give my life to Jesus. They get saved every week at church. Now, I get that. I think that's a beautiful thing. But sometimes what's needed is not jump in the waters all over again. Sometimes what we just need is to have our feet washed. So sometimes what's happening in our life is, man, we're feeling the conviction of the Spirit. Maybe we messed up this last week, or maybe we're struggling with anxiety and we just need God's peace to fill us, or maybe we're making some mistakes at work and there's some tension with a coworker, whatever. We just need Jesus to wash our feet through his Spirit, through his word, through someone speaking truth into our life. Peter, hold on, man. I love your passion, but you're already saved. But what you do need in this moment, Peter, your feet kind of stink. Let me just speak truth right now. And let me wash them for you. Now, herein we see the difference between salvation and what theologians call sanctification. I like the word formation a little better. Salvation is the doorway into a relationship with Jesus. It's that moment a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whenever it was for you. And if you haven't given your life to Jesus, today's the day, by the way. Salvation is that moment. Sanctification or formation is you've stepped through the door, and it's that day by day process of being shaped and formed into the image of God. And it is a process. Man, we're not who we used to be, but God wants to change us even more into his image. He wants to set you free from stuff. He wants you to become more like him. If we're not more like Jesus today than we were a year ago, something is wrong in our formation. Because if day by day we're following after him, we're seeking him, we're serving him, we're putting him first in our life, his Spirit, bit by bit, is gonna change us and shape us and wash the dirt off of us. Now, check out what happens next. Verse 12, it says, when he had finished washing their feet, put on his clothes, and he returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I've done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now you know these things. You will be pleased if you, what? Do them. Let's put verse 14 back on the screen. We did this at our 8 a.m. It was great. I think you guys can be way louder. Video venue too. On the count of three, I want us to read this verse together. 1, 2, 3. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. Interesting to me that this is the takeaway of the story of Jesus washing feet. He says, I've washed your feet, now I want you to wash the feet of others. And it's surprising to me because most people, certainly the way my mind goes is, okay, I've washed your feet, now I'm gonna sit in the seat and I want you to wash mine. I've washed yours, you wash mine. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. But that's not what Jesus does. He washes their feet, not expecting them to wash his feet in return. He washes their feet, expecting them to wash other feet in return. In other words, the debt that they owed Jesus because of his kenosis, the debt that they owed Jesus because of his self-sacrificial pouring out love was to be paid to others. The best way they could honor Jesus in this moment was by honoring others. Jesus says, here's the takeaway, which by the way, I love messages like this because I don't have to come up with some idea, what did Jesus mean here? Jesus says, this is what I mean. I want you to go wash the feet of others. But Jesus, what does that mean? 2019, aside from Fiji, we really don't do this very often. Is Jesus saying that after I get off the stage, we'll have the ushers come forward and one by one, wash feet, pedicures for all? That could get weird, right? And I know that there are some faith traditions that actually do wash feet, and that can be a beautiful thing. But I think it's deeper than that. By washing the feet of his disciples, Jesus is giving us a model of what it means to love one another in radically redemptive, beautifully creative, sacrificial ways. Because in Philippians 2, that whole Kenosis passage, before the Apostle Paul talks about the self-emptying God, he frames the discussion, actually he bookends the discussion by saying, this is how I want you to treat others. Check this out, verse 1, Philippians 2, same passage. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Jesus, any comfort from his love, any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. That's the takeaway. Even as Jesus was called to kenosis, we as followers of Jesus have been called, and this isn't easy to hear, we've been called to be those who empty ourselves for the sake of others. What does that look like? And what does it mean? I think, first of all, it means that kind of love has to care enough to wash the dirt off. You know, we live in a culture when we've defined love as tolerance. And we say that love then is accepting other people's practices and beliefs, even if you think they're wrong. And we've defined hatred as disagreeing with someone's practices and beliefs. But when you look at scripture, what you find is, no, that's a very shallow version of love. Because true love, if it's confronted with dirt, if it's confronted with something that breaks the heart of God, is willing to step into that mess. True love is when you see someone in your life, a son, a daughter, a roommate, and they're making mistakes. And they're messing their life up. And it's like you have a vision of wholeness for them. You can see who they could be if it were not for that infection that's gripped their soul. You know the work of the Spirit that could radically change their life. And your heart's burdened by that. And rather in the name of tolerance, ignoring that and saying, oh, it's all good, your feet are wonderful, you be you, just live your truth. You instead say, you know, I'm gonna care enough to wash the dirt off. I'm gonna love you enough to have that conversation. I'm gonna step into the mess. There's this beautiful line by Rebecca Pippert. She said, love detests what destroys the beloved. Real love stands against the deception, the lie, the sin that destroys. Nearly a century ago, the theologian E.H. Clifford wrote, human love here offers a true analogy. The more a father loves his son, the more he hates in him the drunkard, the liar, the traitor. So we start here. Jesus loved his disciples to the end. And the way he defined that kind of love wasn't quote unquote tolerance. Oh, you know what, your feet are good. No, Jesus is like, they're not. I can smell them from here. And so I want to be a part of the healing process, which brings us to another thought. Love demands an all-in investment, faithfulness, and time. This is key because there are some people I know, you know them as well, who they love verse 1 because they love to point out dirt on people's feet. You know what I'm talking about, right? They're really good, and they call it, quote, discernment, but it's just being a jerk, right? They're really good at saying, you know, I see this in you and that in you, and they critique you, and they love to just pull people apart, and they're skeptical and cynical, and they love anonymous Twitter posts. Like, that's their whole thing. I call them sin sniffers. It's like everywhere they go, just looking for someone to judge and someone to critique. But Jesus shows us a different way. Jesus doesn't judge them for having dirty feet. He kneels down to wash those feet. What if that was the mantra of the church? So many times in our nation today, the church is known as, oh yeah, that's a group of people, they're really good at pointing out dirt in our city. They're really good at judging us and critiquing us and shaming us. But what if the church was known instead as, oh, that's the group of people that they get up and put on a towel and kneel down and they wash the feet of our city? What a different script that would be. And that kind of love demands an all-in investment of faithfulness and time. It will take time because kenosis is not just something that's done over a meal. Jesus had been washing his disciples' feet for years, teaching them, loving them, praying for them. And he would continue to wash the feet of Peter even to the end. And if we want to be the kinds of community, and if you want to be the kind of person that isn't just a sin sniffer, but a culture shaper and a love generator and someone who's gonna transform our world and your neighborhood and this city, we need to be willing to take time. Right after our 8 a.m. gathering, oh man, it was such a story, and there were tears in this moment, and they're sharing with me about their daughter. And at the age of 15, she left home. She moved to Southern California. She was homeless. She got caught up in the whole drug scene, and their hearts were just broken, like absolutely shattered. I can't imagine. My daughter's 14. I can't imagine anything worse than that. And 7 different times they had to go after her and literally rescue her and pull her out of these horrific, dangerous situations. And she said, you know, kenosis for me has meant year after year of loving her, being faithful to pray for her, letting her know that she can come home at any time. not giving up on her, being there for her when she needed me most. And she said that self-emptying, that kenosis was brutal. It was painful. It was hard. There were times when I had nothing left to give, but somehow God just gave me the strength to do it. But here's the best part. She said, our daughter now is saved and wants to get baptized next week and has given her life to Jesus and is now serving the community. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the beauty of kenosis. You're washing, you're serving, you're waiting, you're taking time. Your friend, your coworker, your roommate, your husband, your wife. And bit by bit, radical investment, bit by bit, the dirt comes. I really think this is a word for some of you. Some of you, you've been pouring yourself out for that person and you're ready to walk away because you're like, it's not working. Keep washing, keep waiting, keep loving. Jesus loved his disciples to the end. It's what he's done for us and what he's calling you to do as well. And guess what? Last thought. Love, invested love, is deeper than emotion. It's a choice that we make. I was reminded of that in that conversation with the woman. Did Jesus want to naturally wash the feet of his disciples? Was he like sitting there at dinner like, I can't wait to wash those feet. This is gonna be awesome. No. He made the choice. Kenosis is the moment when you don't want to get up an hour early to pray for your family, but you do anyway. Kenosis is the moment when you have that annoying roommate who's just getting under your skin and you're like, oh, you just want to, and instead you're like, I'm gonna love this guy this week. I'm gonna serve him. Kenosis is the moment when you're driving home from church and you're tempted to make some sarcastic comment about your wife or to your kids, but instead you choose grace. Kenosis is the moment when you don't stop praying for your dad and it seems there's no way he could come to know Jesus. Kenosis is the moment when you look at a city such as ours, instead of judging and critiquing it and pointing out all that's wrong with it, you ask yourself the question, what would it look like for me to be a faithful presence in and for this city? Kenosis is the moment when you're willing to stand up and take a hit for someone else, a hit for the team, to cover them, and instead of pointing out their shame. I experienced something like this on my flight home from Italy. Hands down, the worst flight I've ever taken. There's absolutely no comparison. So first of all, it was a full flight, literally no other seats on the plane. I'm stuck kind of towards the back and I'm sitting right dead center in the middle. On either side of me are two guys, and because it was so full, we weren't able to sit together as a family. So my wife and daughter are sitting in a different part in the plane. It's a 10-hour flight. And we're flying, and about 4 hours or so into the flight, I guess I ate something in Venice and I just started feeling like it's really nauseous, but it hit me so fast. You know how food poisoning works? It hit me so, you can see where this is going. It hit me so fast that sitting right there in my seat, just threw up all over the place. And it was that stage in the flight when, they dim the lights and they're expecting everyone to just sleep, and the two guys next to me were asleep, and not to gross you out, but here it goes. It was everywhere, like pools. It was absolutely dreadful. I'm like, what do I do? Seriously. And I'm like, I'm looking for something to try and clean. And the only thing I could find was the guy next to me, his pillow, which had fallen on the ground. So I'm trying to that was a disaster. Don't ever do that. And they're both still asleep miraculously, and the smell was horrific. And so finally I get up, I'm kind of holding this pillow, this is horrible. And I rush to the restroom, and I get in there, and the full magnitude of what had just happened dawns on me. I'm covered, completely covered. I'm we're not even halfway into the flight. And so I take off my shirt and I put it in that little sink, and for the next 45 minutes, I'm doing laundry. They have those little soap dispenser thingies. So wash. And it's like so small that it's taking forever. I do the same with the trousers. So I come out finally, I smell like, just this weird combination. I won't even go there. And I'm dripping wet. And I walk out, my wife, she had seen me kind of disappear for a while. And she's like, why are you in there so long? And she's like, why are you wet? Why do you stink? I'm like, really? Is it that bad? She's like, it's horrible. You can smell it from all over. And so I tell her what's happening. I go back to my seat and I sit there. And this poor guy next to me, he's getting up and down like a church service. And within like 10 minutes, I could feel it happen again. This time I was able to get back to the restroom. It was horrible. Finally get back to my seat, and I'm sitting there again, and it happened a third time, only this time, just like the first time, it was like instant. I'm like, oh my gosh. The poor guy, I'm like, I need to go again. He's like, okay. I get up. True story, I threw up on all the passengers. Those of you on the front row are getting really nervous right now. Don't worry, I'm better. I threw up on the passengers. It's not funny. There was a mom with a newborn child. I threw up on the baby. Does it get any worse than that? No. This was like rock bottom, and I'm digging. There is and I'm like, oh my gosh, this did not just happen. I'm so sorry. Do you want to come to Westside? No, okay. And I'm like making my way back to the restroom. And it was like the Exodus, like the parting of the sea. And people like, get out of his way, crazy pastor, on the loose. And I get into the restroom. I'm just like clutching the side. I felt so sick. I'm throwing up again. And it was absolutely horrible. I stepped back outside. The shame. And I knew I was going to be talking about self-emptying. I never envisioned it would look like this. And I stepped back out, and it was like a hazmat scene. Like seriously, all hands on deck. All the flight attendants were there, handing out sanitizing cloths. You know a flight has gone bad when they hand out sanitation cloths because of you, right? It was absolutely, and the look of the mother with the newborn child. It was the most humiliating thing ever. And I go back down and I sit down. I'm just kind of curled up like this. I'm like, 5 more hours. I can do this. Finally, the flight lands and I just stay there. I didn't want to get off. I was so embarrassed. I was so humiliated. If you were on this flight, I am so sorry. And I know you're scarred for life, as am I. Everyone gets off. I'm the last one to get off. But here's the crazy bit. This is what I found out. I found out that my sweet wife, my amazing wife, Elisa, when it all came down, the flight attendant, he knew we were married. He goes to my wife, he's like, oh, just so you know, your husband threw up on all the passengers. And she didn't have to do this. Like if I were her, I'd probably just be like, you know what, she can do her thing and I'll just kind of hang out. She gets up and she goes one by one to these passengers and she's apologizing on behalf of me. She's like, I'm so sorry. My husband, he did this. He's a crazy pastor. He didn't mean to. One by one, she's going to all of these passengers. I found this out. I'm like, that is so sweet because I probably wouldn't do that. I married way outside of my league. That is what love looks like. Love is when you step into the mess, right? Love is when you're like, I'll take one for the team. Love is when you're willing to take on the shame of others. And you think about it, isn't that what Jesus did for us? He loved us to the end because that's our story. Man, I've made a mess of things. Jesus, I've messed up. I've done things I regret. We've gone down paths that were destructive and selfish. And yet Jesus said, I'm gonna take that from you. And I'm gonna heal you and cleanse you and wash you and set you free and cover you with my blood. I'm gonna wash your feet. That is the heart of the gospel, the self-emptying God who steps into the mess so that we could be his sons and daughters. And brothers and sisters, that's what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. It's not just showing up at church once a week. That's great. But being a follower of Jesus, he says, if I, your Lord and teacher, have done this for you, I want you to wash the feet of others. So I close with this. Worship team, come on up. Who is the person in your life that the Spirit of God has been speaking to you. And right now, if you have a hearing heart, like if your heart's open to what the Spirit of God is doing in this room, he's gonna speak to you right now. I really believe this. Who is the person in your life that God is saying, I want you to wash their feet? This is the week. Today's the day. And your husband that you've been so quick to just tear apart and put him down. What would it look like for you this week to say, enough of that. I'm gonna wash his feet. I'm gonna look for a way to love him in a way that I haven't for so long. Husbands, yeah, I'm so busy, right? I got so much going on, and you kind of let practical love and romantic love and those things kind of fall to the side. And you know God's been speaking to your heart saying, this is the week. Wash your feet. Wash your feet. A roommate, a coworker, a community, a church, a city. What would it look like for you today, this week, to say, I'm not just gonna be about pointing out the dirt. Anyone can do that. I'm gonna be one that puts on the towel, grabs the basin of water, stoops down, and I'm gonna wash. And I'm gonna pray. And I'm gonna love that person back to wholeness. And I'm gonna ask God's Spirit to bring healing. And even if they get up and walk away, I'll still wait. I'll be there with the basin of water. And when they come back, I'm gonna love them again and again and again. Who is that person for you? And what would it look like for you this week to say, yeah, Lord, Kenosis, you did this for me. Man, you stepped into the mess when I threw up over everyone. And now it's my turn. And it's in that space that we see resurrection and healing and renewal and grace. Let's all stand together.